Putin is profoundly weak at this stage. He's sitting on piles of cash he can't convert. He's spending about 47% of the equivalent of his GDP on defense. That's not sustainable. Inflation's at about 30%. He has a labor shortage. And he is desperate. They were taking 30,000 casualties a month, Kate, which is
Where does that
unsustainable
desperation
now.
put him, though? I wonder if it does put him in a weakened position, if it does mean that he's prepared to negotiate, even if some of the negotiations are ballsy. We completely expect that.
Yeah, I think it's possible that he'll try to get everything he can through some sort of negotiation and feigning, a willingness to conduct or to agree to certain concessions.
It is Kate Borsay. It's the evening edition on Times Radio. Thanks for being with us. Now, Donald Trump is set to speak to Vladimir Putin about a ceasefire in Ukraine. The two leaders will have a phone call tomorrow, with President Trump saying the focus will be on Ukrainian land and power plants and a division of assets. It comes after Russia pushed back on US plans with a series of conditions, including a halt to rearming Ukraine. Earlier, the UK's Foreign Secretary David Lammy issued a warning to Putin about accepting the deal.
If you are serious, prove it with a full and unconditional ceasefire now. And if Putin does not deliver, Mr. Speaker, and I must tell the House that I currently see no sign yet that he is, the G7 meeting helped us ready the tools to get Russia to negotiate seriously.
Well, let's speak to H.R. McMaster, Donald Trump's former national security advisor during his first term. He's also written a book about his time in office called At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. Welcome, H.R. McMaster. Thank you for joining us.
Kate, thank you. It's great to be with you.
There are various theories flying around, and I wonder whether when push comes to shove, you think Vladimir Putin is serious about peace. Is he merely indulging in a folly by speaking to Donald Trump, trying to show willing, or is there some serious intent there?
There's no serious intent there, Kate, for peace. I mean, Vladimir Putin, I think it's really important to understand what drives him. And what drives him is an obsession to restoring Russia to national greatness, really based on the sense of honor lost associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that obsession has led him to pursue the strategy of essentially dragging everybody else down under the theory that he could be the last man standing in Europe. And it's really important to consider what he's done to Ukraine through political subversion, through assassinations and attempted assassinations since 2003, when he poisoned a presidential candidate and permanently disfigured him, through the first invasion in 2014, the broken Minsk agreement, the massive reinvasion of 2022. It's important to place all that in context of the broader campaign against Europe. I mean, he's essentially annexed Belarus, and he's engaged in a shadow war across the continent, cutting undersea cables and burning down warehouses and subverting elections, in Bulgaria and Slovakia and so forth. So Vladimir Putin, from my view, in my opinion, will not stop until he is stopped.
Many people would counter that, wouldn't they, and say, well, yes, maybe a few years ago, but actually now Vladimir Putin is at the point where in 9 months, 12 months or so, he will be seriously financially hindered when it comes to providing, weapons, arms, etc., and troops to fight the battle in Ukraine. And that actually, at this point, he might be more than happy to walk away and concentrate on his domestic policy. Maybe he'll probably walk away with full sovereignty over those 4 Ukrainian oblasts, Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhia. Crimea, of course, is still under Russian control as well. We've heard Donald Trump talk about a division of assets today. That could be more power plants, other things. I just wonder whether there's any chance Vladimir Putin could have pivoted, could have changed on his plans to to reform the Soviet Union.
Well, okay, this is a really important point that you're making, that Putin is profoundly weak at this stage. He's sitting on piles of cash he can't convert. He's spending about 47% of the equivalent of his GDP on defense. That's not sustainable. Inflation's at about 30%. He has a labor shortage. And he is desperate. They were taking 30,000 casualties a month, Kate, which is
Where does that
unsustainable
desperation
now.
put him, though? I wonder if it does put him in a weakened position, if it does mean that he's prepared to negotiate, even if some of the negotiations are ballsy. We completely expect that.
Yeah, I think it's possible that he'll try to get everything he can through some sort of negotiation and feigning, a willingness to conduct or to agree to certain concessions. I think what's really important is to not give those concessions up front. This is what has been concerning to me, is this tendency to take a lot of key issues right off the table. And if the statement that Putin made, albeit before he met the U.S. envoy in Moscow, and indicate anything, it's that he's going to just try to take everything he can. And what's really important, I think, is to go into negotiation with an objective for the United States, Ukraine, and Europe. And that's a sovereign Ukraine that is secure and that can get back on a path to prosperity and will be economically viable. Because we know what Putin will do is he'll pocket everything he can, and then he'll continue in this campaign of subversion. This is what he's trying to achieve by trying to get President Trump to advocate for an election, for example, in Ukraine, to get rid of Zelensky and then try to subvert that election to put in some kind of a Moscow puppet. What Putin wants is to subjugate all of Ukraine. And if he can't do it physically, and he couldn't do it physically thanks to the valor of Ukrainians, he'll try to do it through the sustained campaign of political subversion that we've seen him employ elsewhere.
Why is Donald Trump come to these negotiations, come to these talks, offering so much to Ukraine up front, it seems? Obviously, we're not inside the conversations, but, talking about dividing up certain assets, that doesn't sound particularly good. It's probably realistic if the war's to end now. But you've worked really closely with Donald Trump, and I wonder what you make of his mindset. Is he closely or wants to be more closely aligned to Vladimir Putin? Is this just part of the negotiation? Is he serious when he seems to be offering up so much in advance to Russia?
Well, I've seen him say very kind things about Vladimir Putin. And then in his first year of the presidency, he imposed more sanctions on Russian entities and individuals than the previous 8 years of the Obama administration. He said nice things about Putin, but then he just decided to provide Ukraine with Javelin weapons. So whereas what he says really is distasteful to me, and I think cuts against the overall objective, because I really do think that the way to come into this is from a position of weakness. What he may be doing is trying to convince Putin just to get to the table for a ceasefire. And then I hope we'll take a strong stance, especially on the issue of Ukrainian sovereignty. And this isn't just a real estate deal. It's really important to recognize that what Putin wants is a servile relationship with the Ukrainian rump state that he can dominate. And it's really important to prevent him from doing that. Now, I am concerned about the four provinces and this idea that there could be concessions to give Russia terrain that they don't even occupy at the moment. So I think we'll see how the negotiations continue. We're at the very beginning, but I do think it's important to come in from a position of strength. And this is why I think it's so important that the United Kingdom and the EU have made it clear their intention to really ratchet up the pressure on Putin and ratchet up the pressure on sanctions if he doesn't begin to see to a ceasefire and then begin to negotiate in good faith.
One thing that Ukraine has asked for, and indeed, if there is a peace deal and troops are put on the ground from Keir Starmer's coalition of the willing, people are asking for security guarantees from the United States. That is one thing Western countries are requesting. I wonder what you make of Keir Starmer's coalition of the willing. We heard today a spokesperson saying they expect more than 30 countries to be involved. The Prime Minister's talked about plans to send as many as 30,000 troops to Ukraine. Does this work, in your view?
I think it does work. It depends on the nature of the force, right? It can't just be, some sort of tripwire force. It should be a force that's capable of fighting and prevailing, if Russia were to renew its offensive against Ukraine. I think what's also important here is the increased defense spending in the United Kingdom and the EU. And if there's a silver lining to some of what I find are distasteful statements that President Trump has made about responsibility for the war and seeming to be oversympathetic to the Russians and imposing all the pressure on Ukraine, I think what has happened is there has really been finally in Europe a recognition that unilateral disarmament is not a viable defense policy. And so increasing the capacity of European armed forces and the ability to put together these kind of bespoke coalitions is going to be more and more important. I think what you see, and this is kind of the future of NATO to a certain extent, I think, Kate, is that there will be sub-alliances within the alliance, and especially among those countries who are directly on Russia's frontier and who recognize directly, the nature of the threat to them. And I would put in this category the Nordic states, the Baltic states, Poland, and others who are increasing their defense spending considerably. Even Germany, I think, now has the memo with a CDU coalition-led
changing its fiscal
coalition
rules,
government.
Isn't it? Yeah.
I think that's making a big difference. Hey, the other thing, Kate, is the U.S. mineral agreement with Ukraine. What comes with that, I think, is assured access to the Black Sea. It's really important to understand what Putin wants to do in large measure is to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake. You see him doing that, certainly with trying to dominate Ukraine, but what he's done in Moldova, what he's done to subvert the election in Romania, the sustained campaign of political subversion in Bulgaria. So I think it's really important because to make that deal work, you're going to have continued maritime traffic into Ukrainian ports, which is important for Ukraine's economic viability. But you know what comes with that? The U.S. Navy. And I think that was a really big mistake the Biden administration made of pulling U.S. naval vessels out of the Black Sea in a way that kind of almost greenlighted the reinvasion of Ukraine in February of 2022.
Interesting. Look, thank you for your perspective. Much appreciated. H.R. McMaster, Donald Trump's former national security advisor during his first term, also has written a book about his time in office called At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. Great pleasure to speak to you. Thank you. It is